Have you ever noticed how silence is often mistaken for weakness, especially when you're old enough that people stop asking what you think? And what would it do to you if the only person telling the truth in your own home was a child everyone believed couldn't speak at all? For years, I was told my grandson was mute, not shy, not delayed, simply incapable of speech, and like many things that come with age, I accepted that explanation without resistance because when you depend on others, questioning their certainty feels risky, almost ungrateful. After my fall, my son said it made sense for me to move in with them, said it was safer, temporary, just until I was stronger, and I wanted to believe him because belief at my stage in life felt like the last form of dignity still fully mine. Slowly, without any dramatic moment, my days became organized around their schedules. My routines adjusted to what was best for me. And while no one raised their voice or locked a door, I could feel my independence thinning, not stolen outright, just quietly handled on my behalf. There were small things I noticed but dismissed, like my mail being opened before I saw it, or conversations pausing when I entered the room, or how my daughter-in-law insisted on managing my medication even though I'd taken the same prescriptions for years without trouble. And when I mentioned feeling unusually tired or foggy, she smiled and said that was just part of getting older. My grandson was always nearby, silent, observant, his eyes following everything with a seriousness that didn't belong to a child, and sometimes I felt more seen by him than by the adults explaining my own life to me, though I told myself that was just loneliness talking. One afternoon, my son and his wife left the house together, something they rarely did, promising they'd be back soon, and as the door closed behind them, the house didn't feel peaceful the way it usually did when things were quiet. It felt exposed, like something was no longer being held in place. I sat there listening to the clock, wondering why my chest felt heavier than usual, why my hands were trembling slightly, and for the first time I wondered whether the weakness I felt was truly mine or something slowly placed upon me. Then everything paused, just for a moment, as if the room itself was waiting, and that's when my grandson stepped in front of me, close enough that I could see tension in his jaw, determination in his eyes, and for a brief second I remember thinking how strange it was that the only sound in the house was my own breathing. Then he spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, using my name the way someone does when they need you to understand something immediately, and in that instant reality didn't slowly tighten around me. It snapped. I thought I must be imagining it, that age had finally begun to distort my senses, because when everyone agrees on a version of truth long enough, doubting it feels like doubting yourself. But he spoke again, closer now, and told me the pills I was taking weren't the ones my doctor prescribed, told me they made me weak on purpose, and told me I had to listen carefully because the next part was the most important. And if you think the shock was hearing a mute child speak, you haven't yet grasped the fear that settles in when you realize he waited until they left, because he knew exactly what would happen if they heard him speak at all. Have you ever learned something so disturbing that your first instinct isn't to act, but to stay very still, as if moving too quickly might make it real? I remember looking at my grandson and feeling my heart pound, not from panic but from recognition. The kind that tells you something terrible has already been happening whether you were ready to see it or not. He didn't rush to explain himself or seem relieved to finally speak. Instead, he lowered his voice and glanced toward the hallway, then told me he only stayed silent when his parents were around because the first time he spoke, they didn't yell, they didn't punish him outright, they just became very cold, very controlled, and told him it was better if he stayed quiet, that some things weren't for children to repeat. That kind of anger teaches faster than shouting ever could. He said he heard them talking late at night when they thought everyone was asleep, using careful words and calm tones about how I was getting weaker faster than expected, about how doctors rarely question decline once it starts, and about how soon decisions could be made for my own good. I felt something drop inside me when he repeated those words, not because they were loud or cruel, but because they sounded final, like a conclusion reached without my presence. I asked him, as calmly as I could, how he knew any of this, and for a moment he hesitated, like he wasn't sure how much he should say, then told me he'd seen his mother change my pill bottle once, just once, late at night, and that afterward the pills looked different, though he wasn't sure why, only that after that I slept more, spoke less, and stopped asking questions. He admitted he didn't know if they were dangerous, only that his parents smiled more when I was tired and quiet, and that uncertainty scared me more than certainty ever could. Then he said something that left a deeper mark than anything else, telling me he once tried to ask his father if it was wrong, and was told that children shouldn't interfere in adult matters, especially ones involving grandparents who were already on their way out. That sentence didn't need explanation. It didn't need reflection. It just sat there between us, heavy and unmistakable. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, and in that silence I felt my own weakness more clearly than ever, not as frailty, but as vulnerability, the kind that invites others to decide things for you while convincing themselves it's kindness. I wish I could say my first reaction was anger or resolve, but the truth is harder to admit. Part of me wanted to stay quiet, because at my age, confronting betrayal feels like choosing chaos over the fragile stability you're clinging to. But then I looked at my grandson, carrying a secret no child should have to carry, and understood that my silence had already been drafted into their plan, and that staying quiet now wouldn't protect me. It would only teach him that this is how power works. And just when you think the fear peaks at realizing you're being slowly weakened, a sharper thought cuts through it. They weren't improvising, they were waiting, and the only question that mattered now was how close I was to the moment when waiting would turn into something irreversible. They had no idea I was listening more carefully than ever, and that ignorance became the most dangerous thing in the house. I didn't confront anyone, didn't ask new questions, didn't change my routine in any obvious way, because the normalcy they worked so hard to maintain was also the camouflage hiding their intentions, and I knew instinctively that disrupting it too soon would only tighten their grip. Instead, I watched. I noticed how my daughter-in-law always handled my medication herself, never letting the bottles stay in my room, how my son asked about my energy at the same time every evening, and how both of them seemed quietly relieved when I said I was tired or confused, as if those words checked something off an invisible list. The danger wasn't theoretical anymore, it was scheduled. One afternoon, I overheard a date mentioned casually in the kitchen, said lightly, almost kindly, about an upcoming appointment that would clear things up once and for all. And though they never said my name, I knew exactly who they were talking about. That night, my grandson slid a folded piece of paper into my hand while we sat at the table, pretending to work on a puzzle, and whispered just one thing. A doctor's name, written carefully in uneven letters, copied from an old envelope he'd hidden in his room because he knew it mattered. That small act anchored everything. Proof that I wasn't imagining this, and proof that time was no longer something I could assume I had. I understood then that the real trap wasn't the pills or the paperwork, it was the story being built around me, that I was declining naturally, conveniently, and just quickly enough to justify whatever came next. And once that story hardened, no amount of truth would undo it. I felt the pressure of every hour after that, the need to appear weak without becoming invisible, alert without raising suspicion. And if you think that balance feels empowering, it doesn't. It feels like walking across thin ice while pretending you don't notice the cracks forming under your feet. What steadied me wasn't confidence, but one clear realization. They believed I was fading, which meant they had stopped watching closely, and in that narrow space between assumption and certainty, I had exactly one chance to reach someone before the decision they were quietly preparing became permanent. The moment I picked up the phone, I knew there would be no safe way back if someone walked in. I hadn't waited for luck, only for pattern, because once you live quietly long enough, you learn when a house expects you to stay put. And I used that narrow window to pull my old medical records from behind tax folders I was no longer meant to touch. My hands unsteady not from fear but from the knowledge that I was crossing a line they believed I no longer knew existed. I dialed the number my grandson had given me and listened to it ring, counting each sound like a risk, and when the voice on the other end finally answered and I said my name, there was a pause, not confusion, not surprise, but the kind of silence that tells you this call wasn't supposed to happen. He didn't ask why I was calling. He asked, very carefully, whether I was alone, and that single question stripped away the last of my doubt. I didn't explain everything, didn't accuse anyone, only asked whether the medication I was currently taking matched what he had prescribed, and before he could finish answering, before reassurance or clarity could settle in, I heard the front door open downstairs, earlier than it ever should have, the sound sharp enough to cut straight through the call. I ended the conversation mid-breath, heart racing, realizing that whatever protection I thought I'd gained hadn't arrived yet, and that by reaching out, I hadn't solved the problem. I'd exposed it. Because once you move against a story built on your weakness, the people who depend on that story don't wait patiently for truth. They react. They didn't say anything at first, and that was how I knew the pressure had begun. My daughter-in-law watched me more closely after that day, not openly, just enough to notice when I moved too carefully or paused before answering. And my son suddenly took an interest in things he'd ignored for months, like how much I slept, whether I remembered conversations, whether I felt confused, every question wrapped in concern and delivered with a softness that left no room to object without sounding ungrateful. The house felt smaller, not physically, but strategically, as if invisible lines had been redrawn overnight, and even my grandson sensed it, hovering near me but no longer touching my hand as freely, his eyes flicking toward the hallway before he did, as if checking whether it was still safe to be close. One evening, my medication was brought to me already sorted, no bottles in sight, placed carefully on the table like a settled decision, and when I hesitated just a second too long, my son smiled and said we'd talked about this, that routines were important now, that consistency helped people like me. I remember the pill resting on my tongue, the faint bitterness spreading before I swallowed, my stomach tightening as I wondered whether this was another step downward or simply a test to see how compliant I'd become, and I hated myself in that moment not for taking it, but for understanding exactly why refusing would only strengthen their case. My grandson watched the whole thing without blinking, his small hands clenched in his lap, and when my daughter-in-law glanced his way, he looked down immediately, the message clear enough without words. Silence was no longer just expected from me. Later that night, as I lay awake listening to the house settle, I heard my son mention an appointment scheduled for the end of the week, said casually, almost kindly, about getting everything documented properly. And that was when the fear sharpened into something colder, because I understood then that this wasn't just tighter control, it was preparation. They weren't watching me to see what I'd do next. They were getting ready to explain me to someone else. They didn't frame it as a choice, and that was how I knew this was different from everything that had come before. My son stood by the door with my coat already in his hand, my daughter-in-law checking the time on her phone as if punctuality mattered more than consent. Both of them calm in that rehearsed way that tells you decisions have already been made somewhere you were never invited. For a brief, dangerous moment, I wondered if this was the day my life would be summarized by someone who had never known me, reduced to notes written neatly while I sat quietly in the room. The car ride was deliberately empty. No radio, no small talk, no reassurance, just the sound of tires on pavement and the weight of what wasn't being said. And that silence felt heavier than any argument because it left no space to object without breaking the role they were expecting me to play. My grandson sat in the back, unusually still, his hands folded in his lap, and once his foot brushed against mine by accident, a small contact that felt more like a question than comfort, as if he were asking whether we were still allowed to exist as ourselves outside the house. When we arrived, they walked just ahead of me, not far enough to seem dismissive, only enough to set the pace, and I watched how naturally they spoke to the receptionist, how easily words like decline, confusion, and recent concerns slid into conversation, each one shaping a version of me that sounded increasingly distant from the man I still felt myself to be. We sat in the waiting area, and it struck me then that this was the first time in weeks my medication hadn't been placed in my hand beforehand. Not out of kindness, but because today it would be someone else's job to observe me, to notice how long I paused before answering, how carefully I chose my words, how I held myself when no one told me what to do. The realization tightened my chest, because suddenly my own awareness felt like a liability. My daughter-in-law leaned over and reminded me gently to take my time, not to get confused, to let them help if I forgot something, and the smile she gave me made it clear she already knew how this was supposed to end. As we waited, my grandson tugged lightly at my sleeve and whispered so softly it barely registered as sound that he remembered the doctor's name, that he remembered what I used to take, and that one sentence snapped something inside me awake, because it reminded me this wasn't just an assessment of decline, it was a test of whether truth could survive observation. When we were finally called in, the room felt smaller than it should have, the kind of place where every pause is measured, and as the questions began, my son answered before I finished, my daughter-in-law filled in gaps I hadn't left empty, and I felt time slipping forward without my consent. I knew then that if I let this continue untouched, there wouldn't be another private moment to correct it. So when they misstated a small detail, just one, I corrected it calmly, clearly, without emotion, and the doctor's pen stopped mid-sentence, his eyes lifting from the page to meet mine for the first time. He didn't say anything, but the pause lingered a second too long to be meaningless. And in that second, the story they'd brought with them failed to fully land. As we left, my son's hand stayed on my shoulder a moment longer than necessary, his grip firmer now, and my daughter-in-law smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes, and I understood without needing it explained that something essential had shifted. I hadn't won anything. I hadn't exposed anyone. I had only done one small thing they hadn't planned for. I had reminded the room that I was still there, and the cost of that reminder was already beginning to show. They adjusted immediately, and that speed was what frightened me most. There was no argument on the way home, no accusation, no hint that anything had gone wrong at all, just a quiet recalibration in the air, the sense that a different version of care had been selected and put into motion. By the time we reached the house, my daughter-in-law was already explaining how tiring the appointment must have been for me, how important it was that I rest now, how stress could make confusion worse, and I understood then that the strategy had shifted from observation to containment. The routines tightened subtly but unmistakably. Meals placed in front of me without asking what I wanted, doors closed a little earlier each evening, conversations redirected whenever they drifted toward topics I hadn't approved, all framed as kindness, all executed with the confidence of people who believed they were now justified. Even my son's tone changed, softer but firmer, the voice of someone speaking to a person he no longer considered fully responsible for himself. What unsettled me most was how carefully they avoided mentioning the appointment at all, as if naming it would give it weight, and instead focused on how well I was doing, how cooperative I'd been, praise delivered not to encourage but to condition. My grandson felt the shift before I did. He stayed farther away now, not out of indifference but caution, watching my daughter-in-law's face before approaching me, choosing moments when the room felt unguarded, and once, when he reached for my hand without looking, she cleared her throat softly and he pulled back immediately, eyes dropping to the floor. That single sound carried more authority than words, and watching it work on him did something sharp and permanent inside me. The medication changed again, not in appearance this time, but in timing, doses arriving when I wasn't expecting them, explained as small adjustments meant to help me stay calm, and I felt the fog drift in and out just enough to make me doubt my footing without fully stealing awareness. A precision that told me this was no longer about my health but about manageability. One afternoon, when I tried to set a dose aside quietly, my daughter-in-law was already behind me, her hand closing around the cup before it touched the table, her voice calm as she reminded me we didn't want to confuse the doctor with inconsistencies. And I understood then that my actions were already being tracked, already being prepared for explanation. That night, lying awake, I made one decision I didn't speak aloud. Whatever they put in front of me next, I would not sign anything I hadn't read alone. It wasn't defiance, just a line I refused to let disappear. The next morning, my son mentioned paperwork over breakfast, said lightly that it was better to get things organized while everyone was still calm, and my daughter-in-law nodded, pulling a folder from a drawer I hadn't seen opened in months. She set it on the table between us without pushing it toward me, as if waiting for me to recognize it on my own, and as I stared at that folder, closed, deliberate, final, I understood that silence was no longer protection. It was what the paper was waiting for. The interruption didn't come loudly, and that was why it mattered. Just as my daughter-in-law slid the folder a few inches closer to me, close enough for my name to be unmistakable on the tab, the phone on the kitchen counter rang, sharp and unexpected, and no one moved right away. My son glanced at the screen and hesitated, just long enough for me to understand that this call hadn't been planned, hadn't been scheduled, and therefore hadn't been accounted for. He answered quietly, turning away from the table, lowering his voice as he spoke, and even without hearing the words I caught fragments. A medical office, a question about documentation, something that needed clarification, and the way he said later told me their timeline had just been disturbed. My daughter-in-law kept her eyes on me the entire time, her hand resting lightly on the folder as if anchoring it there, waiting for me to act while the distraction held, and I didn't. I folded my hands in my lap and stayed still, counting the seconds until impatience crept into her posture. When my son returned, he didn't sit down. He said it was nothing serious, just something to clear up later, and the folder remained where it was, no longer urgent but not withdrawn either, a decision paused rather than abandoned. My grandson slid off his chair then and came to me without looking at anyone else, his small hand wrapping around my wrist with a steadiness that startled me. And when my daughter-in-law opened her mouth to redirect him, he spoke first, his voice low but unmistakably clear, asking if I was allowed to read things before signing them or if they were supposed to explain what they said instead. The room went still, not tense or angry, just suspended, as if everyone were waiting to see which version of reality would be acknowledged. My daughter-in-law laughed softly, saying children ask the strangest questions, but her hand moved away from the folder without her seeming to notice she'd done it. No one pushed the papers toward me again. Breakfast continued in fragments, conversation drifting to neutral ground, but the air had changed, and I felt it in the way my son avoided my eyes, in the way my daughter-in-law busied herself with unnecessary tasks, in the way my grandson stayed close without touching me, as if proximity itself had become something to manage. Later, when I was finally alone in my room, I found the folder placed just outside my door, leaning against the wall where I couldn't miss it, close enough to remind me, far enough to suggest patience. They weren't abandoning the plan. They were adjusting it. And as I lay there listening to the house settle, I understood with unsettling clarity that delay had introduced risk into a system that depended on control, and that the next move wouldn't be about signatures at all, but about removing what they could no longer reliably predict. The change came the next morning, and it arrived wrapped in reason. My daughter-in-law mentioned it casually while clearing the table, said it was probably for the best if my grandson spent a few days with his aunt, just until things settled, just to give everyone some breathing room, and the way she said it, light, practical, almost considerate, told me this decision had been waiting for the right moment to surface. My son agreed immediately, too quickly, adding that children absorb stress, that it wasn't healthy for him to be around so much uncertainty, and I understood then that what they were really removing wasn't the child, but the uncertainty he represented. No one asked what I thought. They didn't need to. This wasn't framed as separation or punishment, only as good parenting, responsible caretaking, something no reasonable person could object to without sounding selfish or unstable. My grandson stood near the doorway listening, his face carefully blank in the way children learn to make it when they don't want adults to know they understand more than they're supposed to. And when he looked at me, there was no fear in his eyes, only a quiet focus, as if he were trying to memorize me in case this goodbye needed to last longer than anyone was admitting. I wanted to say something, anything that would slow it down, but every sentence I imagined collapsed under its own risk and silence. Once my shield became the only response that wouldn't be used against me. The house changed the moment he left. It wasn't louder or quieter, just emptier in a way that felt deliberate, as if a stabilizing element had been removed and the system had finally been simplified. The routines tightened again, but now without the need for pretense. Meals appeared without comment, medication was placed directly in my hand, doors stayed closed longer, and the careful performance of concern gave way to efficiency. I felt truly isolated for the first time, not lonely but isolated, and that distinction mattered because isolation doesn't ache. It sharpens. My son checked on me more frequently now, asking the same questions with minor variations, listening less to my answers than to how consistently I delivered them, while my daughter-in-law made calls in rooms she assumed were out of earshot, her voice low and procedural, using words like coordination and follow-up as if the outcome were already agreed upon elsewhere. That evening, she brought the folder back into the room and placed it on the table without ceremony. It made a soft, final sound as it landed, paper against wood, and I noticed its weight immediately, how much space it occupied despite being so thin. There was no smile this time, no explanation, just presence, and without my grandson there, the folder felt heavier somehow, as if nothing in the room remained that could interrupt what it represented. She said calmly that this would be easier now, that we could take our time without distractions, that this was really about making things simpler for everyone, and I understood then that destabilization hadn't ended the danger, it had refined it. Control hadn't disappeared when questioned. It had reorganized. I picked up the folder but didn't open it, feeling its stiff edge press into my palm, aware that every option was narrowing. And as I sat there in that quieter, more efficient house, one truth settled with devastating clarity. Clean outcomes don't need witnesses, and they leave very little behind for anyone else to question. They chose the afternoon deliberately, when the house was quiet enough to feel settled and the light through the windows made everything look reasonable, almost forgiving, because urgency is easier to impose when nothing appears urgent at all. My son brought the folder to me without asking, set it down in the same place as before, and this time placed a pen beside it, careful and precise, an object arranged to suggest finality rather than choice. He said there was no rush, not really, but that it made sense to do this while my head was clear, while things were calm, and I understood then that calm had become their word for compliance. My daughter-in-law stood near the doorway, not blocking it, just close enough to make leaving the room feel unnecessary and therefore unreasonable, and the quiet coordination between them told me this wasn't a discussion. It was a process reaching its last step. I opened the folder slowly, buying time where I could, the paper whispering as it shifted, and read language that sounded protective on the surface but hollow underneath. Sentences built to reassure while transferring control so gently they almost felt kind. They spoke in turns, offering explanations that never quite answered anything, highlighting benefits instead of consequences, and carefully avoiding words like permanent even as every line leaned toward it. And I felt the pressure not as fear but as a countdown, the sense that hesitation itself was now being measured. Then there was a knock at the door, firm but unhurried, the kind of knock that assumes it will be answered, and it landed wrong in the room, out of rhythm with everything they'd arranged. My daughter-in-law froze for a fraction of a second before smoothing her expression, and my son frowned, already irritated by the disruption, asking who could possibly be coming now. No one answered him. The knock came again, followed by a voice from the other side, clear and professional, asking if this was the correct address and whether I was home, and I felt my breath catch not because I recognized the voice, but because it carried authority that hadn't been filtered through my family. My son opened the door just wide enough to block the room, and through the gap I saw a man holding a clipboard against his chest, standing upright, patient, using my name without hesitation, and the pause that followed stretched thin enough to matter. They didn't look at me right away after that. My daughter-in-law stepped forward first, saying calmly that now wasn't a good time, that matters like this were handled through proper channels, and the voice outside replied just as calmly that this wasn't an appointment, only a follow-up that needed to be addressed in person. My son glanced back at the table, at the folder, at the pen still waiting where he'd placed it, and asked me whether I felt up to speaking, the question framed as care but carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. The choice was unmistakably mine, narrow but real. I closed the folder without signing it, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and said I would like to speak for myself, slowly and clearly, with no one else answering for me. The door opened wider, the clipboard shifted into view, and behind me the pen remained untouched on the table, small and ordinary, waiting in a room that no longer belonged entirely to the story they'd prepared.